In November of 1880, Thomas G. Taylor, superintendent of the Yellow Jacket mine on the Comstock Lode, recorded in the company diary that a drill hole at the 900-meter level had struck water under considerable pressure. The temperature of that water was 77 degrees Celsius, hot enough to scald a man to the bone in seconds, and it came in fast enough that the new Yellow Jacket shaft flooded before the pumps could be repositioned. Taylor did not speculate about where the water came from. He measured it, logged it, and kept working, because that was his job, and because Virginia City in 1880 was not a town that stopped for anything, least of all a flood, a mile under its own streets. The mine went under. The men climbed out. And Taylor wrote down a number that geologists are still trying to explain a century and a half later. What you are looking at, if the camera could travel down that shaft, is not a leak. It is not surface runoff finding its way into a crack. It is something closer to a sealed chamber of heat and pressure that the miners of the Comstock Lode broke into again and again, at depth after depth for 60 years, without ever fully understanding what they had opened. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Comstock Lode sits beneath Virginia City, Nevada, a silver and gold deposit discovered in 1859 that would, by the time it was exhausted, produce more than $700 million in ore. The mines went deep to follow it, deeper than almost any hard rock operation in the country at the time, past 3,000 feet in places, and at those depths the miners stopped finding water in the way they expected. They found it hot. Not warm from friction or from the pressure of rock, hot enough to cook a man where he stood. Recorded temperatures inside the Yellow Jacket workings reached 75 degrees Celsius in dry drill holes and rose past that in standing water. At the Ophir, the Cholla, the Potosi, and the Crown Point mines, temperatures between 54 and 69 degrees Celsius were measured at depths between 500 and 600 meters, consistent enough across separate shafts, separate companies, and separate crews that no single local explanation accounted for it. The miners called themselves hot water plugs, a nickname that stuck because so many of them worked stripped to the waist in tunnels where the rock itself sweated. On February the 13th of 1882, a second flood struck the Exchequer mine, 69 degrees Celsius pouring in from the 853-meter level, drowning pumps and rising until it reached the level of a tunnel that had been built 4 years earlier for the specific purpose of making sure this never happened again. That tunnel was the work of Adolph Sutro, a Prussian-born engineer who arrived on the Comstock in 1860 and watched the flooding problem nearly destroy the district's mining economy before it had properly begun. Sutro proposed a drainage adit nearly 4 miles long, cut from the valley floor near Dayton up to the Savage Mine beneath Virginia City, intersecting the lode at a depth of 1,640 feet. Mine owners fought him for most of a decade, afraid an independent access tunnel would break their control of the district. Construction began in October of 1869 and finished in 1878, 9 years of blasting through rock that itself ran hot, and when it was done, the tunnel drained hot sulfurous water out of the mountain at a rate that at its peak exceeded 1 billion gallons a year. President Ulysses S. Grant rode through it in 1879 as a curiosity, a tourist in a mountain that had nearly killed the men who dug it. What the tunnel could not do was explain the heat. Sutro built a solution before anyone had a cause. The geological record on this point has never fully closed, and it is worth saying so plainly rather than filling the gap with a name. Modern surveys of the district have noted that once the water level in the Comstock workings fell below the elevation of the Sutro Tunnel, it did not rise back to that level again, not even after pumping stopped, for as long as the workings remained open to observation. That behavior argues against a simple picture of distant hot water traveling upward through the rock from some far reservoir. It suggests instead that the heat is local, sealed within the volcanic and intrusive rock of the lode itself, trapped rather than flowing. Which raises a plainer question than any headline needs. If the heat was sealed in the rock, and the rock had been sealed for longer than any mining company's records go back, What exactly were the miners of 1880 opening when they drilled into it? The final chapter of the Comstock's relationship with its own water came in 1918, when the last pumps were shut off. The workings, no longer worth the cost of keeping dry, were allowed to flood back up to the level of the Sutro Tunnel, the 1,640-foot mark that Sutro had cut into the mountain 4 decades earlier. Every mine below that level has remained underwater since. All mining on the Comstock from 1920 forward has taken place above that line, which means that for more than 100 years, the deepest workings of one of the richest silver deposits in American history have simply been left alone, sealed underwater, that came back exactly to the depth a 19th century engineer had drained it to, and stayed there. Long before any of this, before Sutro, before Taylor's diary entry, before a single shaft had been sunk into Mount Davidson, the people who lived on this ground had a name for what moved beneath standing water. Northern Paiute and Washoe oral tradition describes beings the Washoe call water babies, spirits that inhabit springs, ponds, and underground channels across the Great Basin. A tribal history compiled with the United States Forest Service records that Washoe healers traveled to sacred sites such as Cave Rock, specifically to consult with these beings, bringing offerings and seeking renewal of their own spiritual authority, and that the same tradition holds these places require distance and respect from those without that training. The same Forest Service history notes that when construction crews blasted through portions of Cave Rock in 1931, and again in 1951, and flooding followed later in Carson Valley, local tradition attributed the flooding to water babies disturbed by the blasting. A separate ethnographic study prepared for the Federal Bureau of Land Management documents Southern Paiute traditions of an underground hydrological system linking valleys across southern Nevada, through which these same water spirits were understood to travel between sites. This is not a single legend, collected once and repeated. It is a pattern recorded independently by different researchers working with different bands decades apart, describing the same underlying claim that the water beneath this ground was neither empty nor inert, and that breaking into it carried a cost that outsiders would not see until it was already paid. None of this was consulted by the mining companies that sank the Comstock shafts. There is no evidence in the surviving company records, the annual reports, or Taylor's own diary that any Paiute or Washoe account of the water beneath Mount Davidson was ever brought to a mine superintendent's attention, or that it would have changed a single decision if it had been. The mines were driven by assay values and stock prices, not by the traditions of the people whose land they sat on. What the record shows instead is 2 separate bodies of testimony about the same ground, developed without reference to each other, arriving at the same conclusion by different roads. That the water under the Comstock Lode did not behave like ordinary water, that it announced itself with heat and pressure that no surface process fully explained, and that the people who had lived there longest had already built a framework for understanding it a full century before Thomas Taylor wrote 77 degrees Celsius into a company diary and went back to work. The Comstock was not the only place in this stretch of Nevada where hot water beneath the ground and human testimony about that water arrived at the same point from opposite directions. 15 miles north of Virginia City, in what is now the southern edge of Reno, a field of hot springs and steam vents called Steamboat Springs once threw a geyser 70 feet into the air, the 3rd largest such formation recorded in the United States at the time settlers first documented it. Washoe, Northern Paiute, and Western Shoshone people moved through the Great Basin with the seasons and treated this ground, along with the other hot springs scattered across the region, as sacred. Early emigrant diaries from the 1840s describe the plumes of steam and note that indigenous travelers used to place stones into the openings and watch them steam and hiss, treating the ground as something that answered when touched, rather than something inert. On December the 10th of 1900, an earthquake struck the district, and the geyser went silent. The pools that had run for as long as anyone had recorded simply stopped. It did not return for nearly 100 years, and when it did, in 2024, it came back not as a geyser, but as new fissures splitting open ground, and roads that had shown nothing unusual the season before. Water measured at over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, breaking through asphalt that had never cracked on its own. 90 miles south of Virginia City, at Cave Rock on the shore of Lake Tahoe, a different but related tradition survives in a tribal history, compiled with the assistance of the United States Forest Service. Washoe healers traveled to Cave Rock specifically to consult with beings the tradition calls water babies, understood to inhabit the water there, bringing offerings and treating the site with a caution that outsiders were told to respect. When tunnel blasting disturbed the rock in 1931 and again in 1951, the same history records that later flooding in Carson Valley was attributed by local tradition to those disturbed beings. 200 miles to the south, in Delamar Valley, an academic study of Southern Paiute cultural geography documents a comparable belief, an underground hydrological system understood to connect separate valleys through which the same category of water spirit was said to travel, with shamans making prepared ceremonial visits to specific points along that system rather than approaching it casually. What is consistent across Steamboat Springs, Cave Rock, and Delamar Valley is not the language used to describe what lives in the water. The Washoe called them water babies. The Southern Paiute of Delamar Valley placed them within a wider system of portals and ceremonial geography. What is consistent is the underlying claim, made independently by different bands across 200 miles of the same geologic province, that water emerging from underground in this part of the Great Basin is neither passive nor safe to disturb without preparation, and that disturbing it produces consequences, whether a dried spring, a flood in a neighboring valley, or a geyser silenced for a century. What is consistent in the institutional response is something else. At none of these three sites, so far as the surviving record shows, did any government agency or mining company treat the tradition as information to be tested rather than background color. Steamboat Springs was developed as a health resort in 1859 and later drilled for geothermal power, first as a pilot project in 1986, with 2 additional plants brought online in 1992. Decades of extraction proceeding without any documented consultation of the tradition that had marked the ground as one requiring particular respect. Cave Rock was blasted for highway tunnels twice in the 20th century before public dispute eventually brought the Washoe account to wider attention, and even then, the response was restricted climbing access rather than any inquiry into what the tradition had actually claimed about the site. The pattern is not concealment. Nobody hid these accounts. They were published, in some cases by federal agencies themselves. The pattern is that publication and consultation are not the same thing, and a record can sit in a government report for decades, cited by researchers, unread by anyone with the authority to change what happens on the ground it describes. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The evidence in this account does not require excavation to examine, because none of it has been buried. It requires only that it be looked at together rather than in the separate boxes where it currently sits, geology in one file, mining history in another, tribal oral tradition in a third, each maintained by a different institution with no obligation to read what the others have recorded. The Sutro Tunnel still exists, its portal near Dayton, Nevada, preserved today by a non-profit historical group and open to limited public tours, still running with the same hot, mineral water it was cut to drain 150 years ago. The flooded lower levels of the Comstock Lode, everything below the 1,640-foot mark, have sat underwater without interruption since 1918, unexamined by any survey since the pumps were shut off, the heat that produced them never definitively traced to its source by the geologists who have studied the district since. Steamboat Springs is, as of this year, visibly active again, new ground cracking open in places that showed nothing the season before, watched now by residents with phones rather than by anyone conducting a formal study of why a system silent for a century has begun to move. Thomas G. Taylor's diary entry, from November of 1880, is still readable in the archived company records of the Yellow Jacket mine, 77 degrees Celsius, considerable pressure, the shaft lost within hours. It sits a few sentences away from routine notations about timber deliveries and payroll, the temperature of a near-boiling flood, recorded with the same flat hand a clerk would use for a shipment manifest, because to Taylor it was simply another entry in a season full of them. He was not trying to prove or disprove anything about what lay beneath the Comstock. He was keeping the mine running. And it is precisely that indifference, that lack of any interpretive framework beyond the next day's pumping schedule, that makes his diary a more honest witness than any theory built after the fact. He wrote down what the drill hit. He did not know, and had no reason to ask, whether the people who had lived on that mountain before him already had a name for it. They did, not a scientific name, not a temperature or a depth, but a working understanding, passed down and eventually written into federal ethnographic surveys decades after the mines had gone quiet, that the water underneath this stretch of the Great Basin was not simply water, it moved. It remembered disturbance. It answered in its own timing, on its own terms, to what was done to it, whether that was a blast at Cave Rock in 1931, or a well drilled at Steamboat in 1986, or a shaft driven 800 feet into Mount Davidson looking for silver. The mining companies of the Comstock never read that tradition, and the ethnographers who eventually recorded it never audited the mining company's pump logs against it. Two records, describing one mountain, kept in separate rooms. What remains, if you take the physical record on its own terms without requiring it to resolve into either a folk tale or a footnote, is 150 years of instrumented, dated, superintendent-signed testimony that something in the rock beneath western Nevada holds heat and pressure that no complete geological model has yet closed the loop on, standing beside an equally long, equally documented tradition kept by the people who were there first, that the same water carries consequence for those who reach it without asking. The stones do not care which discipline claims them. The water underneath Mount Davidson is still down there tonight, sealed at the 1,640-foot line where Sutro left it, exactly where two separate kinds of record, arrived at from two directions that never spoke to each other, both said it would be. There is one more record worth setting beside Taylor's diary, because it comes from the other side of the mountain in a way none of the tribal histories quite do. In 1883, a Northern Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca, born near the Humboldt Sink and raised within sight of the same ranges that fed the Comstock's water table, published a memoir titled Life Among the Paiutes. It was the first book known to have been written and copyrighted by a Native American woman in the United States. Winnemucca was not an ethnographer working through an interpreter, and she was not a mining engineer filing an annual report. She was a named literate witness, writing in her own hand about the land her people had occupied before the silver rush overran it, and her book does not treat that land as empty or as background. It treats it as inhabited, in the fullest sense the word can carry, by more than the people who could be counted in a census. No mining company footnoted her. No geological survey of the district cites her memoir among its sources, then or since. Though it was in print, and available the same decade, Thomas Taylor was logging flood temperatures a few dozen miles from where she grew up. Two books, published in the same 10 years, describing the same stretch of Nevada from opposite sides of a silver curtain, neither aware the other existed as a document worth reading against itself. The mountain itself has outlasted both authors. Today, the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology continues to monitor rock temperatures across the old Comstock workings as a documented geothermal resource, decades after the last commercial shaft went dark, because the heat that flooded the Yellow Jacket in 1880 has never gone anywhere. It is still down there, filed now under a different heading, measured with different instruments, by people who inherited the mountain without inheriting either of the two accounts written about what moves beneath it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.